Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving right into two fiercely contrasting paradigms of global security, pulled directly from our source material. On one side, we have a really stark warning coming from the highest levels of U.S. diplomacy. And on the exact opposite side, there's this radical challenge to that entire framework, one that proposes a massive shift in how we view history, how we handle accountability, and honestly, how we ensure the survival of our shared civilization. So we're going to break down the official security doctrine first, and then explore a really compelling call for an entirely alternative diplomatic path forward. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the global security doctrine. Second, rebalancing the moral scale. Third, diverging narratives on Ukraine. Fourth, the collapsed diplomatic bridges. Fifth, an alternative diplomatic path. And sixth, the stakes for humanity. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Global Security Doctrine.
We're starting off with a July 2026 address given by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He argues that the absolute first, sacred duty of any state is protecting its people, period. And to show that modern counterterrorism frameworks have actually been working, he points to a really remarkable statistic. After the West pivoted its security strategy post-September 11th, the global coalition largely dismantled the ISIS caliphate. The result of that? The number of people killed by jihadist terrorism in Europe dropped by roughly 97% from 2015 to 2024. Think about that for a second. His argument is that the post-9/11 strategy has, by and large, been a success.
But this is exactly where the doctrine takes a pretty sharp turn. Secretary Rubio argues that despite all this success, the West has developed this dangerous transnational blind spot. He asserts that academia, the press, and these older legacy institutions have basically systematically ignored or excused or maybe even romanticized rising extremist violence when it comes from the political far left. He says they're treating it like a partisan fiction rather than a deadly reality.
And he roots this argument deep in history. He traces a direct line of far-left terror from groups like Colombia's FARC to Italy's Red Brigades, the Weather Underground in the US, and Greece's 17 November organization. But according to this official doctrine, we aren't just talking about history here. He argues that today's Antifa militants and similar groups are actually operating as interconnected transnational networks. They're sharing propaganda, training, and financing, all driven by this shared hatred for Western civilization and, as he puts it, a desire to destroy what greater men have built. Now, the data he uses to prove this is a present-day crisis is honestly pretty startling. The speech cites a 40% jump in far-left violence in Germany in just a single year. It also notes that in Greece, over 80% of radical violence is now being driven by far-left and anarchist actors. And we're not just talking about minor protests. This includes deadly attacks on politicians, sabotaging railways, and even striking power grids, like a recent 5-day blackout in Berlin. So his message is incredibly clear. The civilized world has to unite to dismantle these networks brick by brick. Section 2. Rebalancing the moral scale. This perfectly sets up our second source, which is a July 2026 open letter addressed to Secretary Rubio titled Kukulkan Anunnaki Crown. Now, the author of this letter doesn't deny the extremist violence that Rubio just mentioned, but they present a massive counterargument. They say the architects of Western foreign policy have to be evaluated on the exact same moral scale as non-state actors. The idea here is that if we only ever look at the enemies of civilization, we completely miss the architecture that actually manufactures those enemies in the first place. So at the very core of this thesis is a direct comparison of violence. Just imagine a scale. On one side, you have non-state political violence, your bombings, kidnappings, extremist attacks. On the other side, you have state-sponsored violence, things like colonial domination, covert regime change, military occupation, and economic coercion. The author's arguing that a deliberate killing doesn't magically become acceptable just because it was authorized by a government intelligence service or victorious superpower. The letter strongly warns against what it calls the architects of the word, meaning the people who get to decide which violence is branded as terrorism and which is safely filed away under the guise of security. Section 3. Diverging narratives on Ukraine. So what does this actually look like in the real world? How do these two totally different paradigms collide during a geopolitical crisis? Well, the Kukulkan letter maps out two distinct narratives regarding the war in Ukraine. First, you have the mainstream Western or official NATO view. This perspective really starts the clock in February 2022, framing Russia's invasion as entirely unprovoked aggression driven by imperial ambition, where NATO expansion was just a voluntary secondary factor. In sharp contrast, you have the realist alternative view, which starts the clock decades earlier. This view argues the war was largely provoked by NATO's eastward expansion, which completely ignored Russian security red lines. It suggests that keeping Ukraine permanently neutral was the realistic path that could have avoided war altogether. Now, to be clear, the source does not justify the invasion. It explicitly states that Russian responsibility doesn't grant the West historical innocence. To really hammer home the need to examine the architects behind this conflict, the letter points directly to a 2008 diplomatic cable from William J. Burns. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time and later became the CIA director. In that cable, he explicitly warned Washington that Ukrainian entry into NATO was the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite. The letter uses this specific warning to argue that the dangers of this escalating confrontation were known well over a decade before the invasion. Because of that, the author argues history has every right to investigate the judgments made by Western administrations and intelligence agencies.
Section 4. The collapsed diplomatic bridges.
A really critical argument made in the letter is that our current trajectory toward war was quite literally paved by failed diplomacy. You can see how this crisis escalated step by step as these diplomatic bridges collapsed over time. It goes from that 2008 warning to the Minsk agreements in 2014 and 15, escalating all the way to the full-scale Russian invasion in February 2022. And then, finally, there was a brief window of opportunity during the Istanbul negotiations in March and April of 2022. And when we look closely, we can see exactly why diplomacy failed in these instances. Take the Minsk agreements, which proposed a ceasefire and special status for the Donbass region. It ultimately fell apart over a fatal sequencing dispute. Basically, who goes first? Ukraine demanded security first, while Russia demanded political steps first. Neither side budged, so the bridge collapsed. Then, jump to the 2022 Istanbul negotiations. Ukraine actually proposed permanent neutrality in exchange for multilateral security guarantees. Drafts were being exchanged, but it collapsed over disagreements on the size of Ukraine's army, the exact nature of those security guarantees, the horrific discovery of atrocities in Bucha, and, fundamentally, a severe lack of trust. The letter asks a really haunting question here. Did every government involved actually do everything in its power to keep that diplomatic opening alive?
Section 5. An alternative diplomatic path.
Having diagnosed all these massive systemic failures of the old world order, we finally arrive at the core focus of our explainer today. This is the UUCGA Anunnaki Crown. It's being proposed as a totally independent, strictly neutral bridge for planetary cooperation. The author is arguing that legacy institutions, like the United Nations, are just hopelessly trapped. They're bogged down by vetoes, unipolar bargaining, and the endless interests of competing powers. If the current system is just going to keep reproducing division and warfare, the author insists we have to build a neutral alternative entirely outside of those inherited hierarchies, and crucially, without seeking permission from the very systems they are challenging. The letter actually outlines a very specific path to achieve this restored balance. Step 1. Investigate uncomfortable historical continuities. For example, it asks how defeated World War II intelligence networks, like the former Nazi scientists absorbed into the U.S. through Operation Paperclip, literally migrated into the Cold War architecture that still targets Moscow today. Step 2. Totally refuse institutional assimilation into systems that prioritize strategic dominance over planetary health. Step 3. Actively build neutral bridges grounded in ancient wisdom and ecological responsibility. And finally, step 4, treat all civilizations, and that explicitly includes the global south and indigenous peoples, as conscious co-authors of our future, rather than just treating them like expendable pieces on an imperial chessboard.
Section 6. The stakes for humanity.
So why does this alternative path matter right now? Well, because both of these sources, despite having vastly different worldviews, fundamentally agree on one thing. The survival of our shared civilization is literally on the line. The stakes go way beyond traditional geopolitics. We're talking about everything from the threat of thermonuclear catastrophe to total ecological deterioration. But there is also a uniquely modern warning here about technology. The author strongly cautions that if we train artificial general intelligence, and eventually superintelligence, on our unresolved conflicts, on these doctrines of permanent enemies, and on selective histories written only by the victors, we are going to reproduce our human imbalances at a superhuman scale. The AI will basically just amplify the old world's architecture of a war.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought. As we face down these transnational threats and stare at our collapsed diplomatic bridges, can we actually break free from the architecture of permanent enemies? Will our future merely echo the reflexes and conflicts of the old world? Or can it be consciously co-authored to build a totally new era of balance? Thank you so much for joining this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the frameworks that shape our world.